When Barron Trump walked into the small, upscale cafe in downtown New York, he hardly expected anything out of the ordinary. Dressed in a casual yet refined outfit, he moved with a quiet confidence that turned a few heads, but didn't disrupt the relaxed ambiance of the establishment. The cafe, known for its artisanal coffee and exclusive clientele, was the kind of place where people minded their own business. He ordered a black coffee, politely thanking the barista, and took a seat by the window. The city buzzed outside, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He scrolled through his phone, occasionally looking up to take in the surroundings. Despite being the son of one of the most talked-about figures in the world, he had mastered the art of blending in, until today. A man, perhaps in his late 40s, entered the cafe. His disheveled appearance contrasted sharply with the polished atmosphere of the place. His eyes darted around before locking onto Barron. Something about his intense gaze set an uneasy tone, and a few patrons exchanged wary glances. Barron noticed the man approaching but remained calm. He had encountered strangers before, some admirers, some critics, but he never let his composure slip. The man stopped a few feet away, standing awkwardly as if debating whether to speak. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're Barron Trump, aren't you?" His voice carried a strange mix of curiosity and urgency. Barron slowly looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he answered simply. The cafe grew quieter as nearby customers tuned into the exchange. The man took a step closer, lowering his voice but keeping the intensity in his eyes. "I have to ask you, what's it like?" Barron raised an eyebrow. "What's what like?" "Being part of that family, growing up under all that scrutiny. Do you ever feel free?" The question was unexpected, and for a brief moment, Barron considered his answer. He had been asked countless things about his father, his life, the expectations placed upon him, but rarely something so personal, so direct. He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "Freedom is a perspective," he finally said. "People assume I live in a cage, but it depends on how you define it. I have responsibilities, yes, expectations, but doesn't everyone?" The man's face twitched, as if unsatisfied with the response. "That's not what I mean. You were born into it. You didn't have a choice. The rest of us, we get to decide what we believe in, who we follow. Do you?" Barron studied the man, sensing a deeper frustration beneath his words. "Choice isn't always about where you start," he replied. "It's about what you do with what you have." The cafe was completely silent now. Even the barista had paused, pretending to wipe down the counter while listening intently. The man let out a short, bitter laugh. "Spoken like a true politician's son." Barron didn't flinch. He had heard similar remarks before, but he didn't react defensively. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You seem angry," he observed. "Not at me, though, at something bigger." The man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Maybe, or maybe I just don't trust power when it's handed to someone." Barron nodded slowly. "Then maybe you should be asking yourself why you think power is something that's only given. If you believe in making your own way, then you already have it." For a long moment, the man said nothing. He simply stared at Barron, as if searching for something, perhaps arrogance, perhaps ignorance. But what he found instead was unsettling. It was clarity. The tension in the air finally broke when Barron picked up his coffee again. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said, taking a sip. "But you should think about what you really want to prove." The man opened his mouth as if to say something, but stopped himself. Instead, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. Barron smirked faintly. "Most people aren't." With that, the man gave a small nod and walked away, disappearing into the bustling city outside. The cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but those who had witnessed the exchange couldn't shake the feeling that they had just seen something remarkable. Barron Trump, at just 18, had handled the situation with a level of grace and introspection that left everyone speechless. As the cafe buzzed back to life, murmurs spread among the patrons. Some exchanged glances, still processing what they had just witnessed. A few whispered to each other, debating whether the encounter had been tense, profound, or perhaps both. Even the barista, who had been discreetly listening in, hesitated before resuming her work. Barron, however, remained unbothered. He simply returned to his coffee as if nothing unusual had happened, but beneath his composed demeanor he was reflecting. Encounters like this weren't rare for him. People often felt compelled to challenge him, to test him. It wasn't always about politics. Sometimes it was about curiosity, resentment, or even their own personal struggles. A woman sitting nearby leaned over slightly, unable to contain her thoughts any longer. "That was something," she remarked cautiously. Barron looked up, offering a polite smile. "People are passionate," he said simply. She hesitated, then asked, "Does that happen a lot?" He considered his answer for a moment before responding, "More than you'd think." The woman nodded, clearly still intrigued. "And you always handle it like that?" Barron gave a small shrug. "There's no point in reacting emotionally. Most people just want to be heard." Across the cafe, a man in a business suit leaned over to his colleague. "That kid's got more composure than half the politicians in this city," he muttered. His colleague chuckled in agreement. Meanwhile, outside the cafe, the man who had confronted Barron lingered near the curb, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He stared at the pavement, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had entered the cafe expecting to provoke a reaction, maybe defensiveness, maybe arrogance. But what he got instead was something entirely different. Barron's words echoed in his head. "Then maybe you should be asking yourself why you think power is something that's only given." The man exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He had spent years resenting the system, believing that power was hoarded by those born into privilege. But here was a young man, barely an adult, who didn't wield his status as a weapon, who didn't try to prove anything. Instead, he simply existed in a state of self-assurance, answering challenges with thoughtfulness rather than hostility. A strange realization settled over him. Perhaps power wasn't about inheritance or control. Perhaps it was about knowing who you are, regardless of what the world throws at you. Inside, Barron finished his coffee and checked the time. He stood up, adjusting his jacket before making his way to the door. As he stepped outside, the man looked up as if debating whether to say something. Barron met his gaze and, after a brief pause, gave him a small nod. Not one of superiority, not one of dismissal, just simple acknowledgement. A moment of understanding. The man didn't say a word. He just nodded back, watching as Barron disappeared into the city crowd, leaving behind a conversation that no one in that cafe would soon forget. And just like that, the son of one of the most powerful men in the world had once again proven that true strength isn't in dominance. It's in how you carry yourself when the world is watching. As Barron walked down the busy New York street, the moment lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Some would tell the story later that evening to friends and family, describing how a young man, constantly in the public eye, had handled an unexpected confrontation with a calmness that seemed beyond his years. The cafe door swung shut behind him, the bell jingling softly. The air outside was crisp, the hum of traffic and distant sirens filling the space between his thoughts. He wasn't rattled. This wasn't the first time someone had approached him like that, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But there was something different about this encounter. The man's words still echoed faintly in his mind. "Do you ever feel free?" It was an odd question, but one that had made him pause. Most people assumed they knew the answer, that he must feel trapped, weighed down by expectations, his last name dictating his future. But was that true? He continued walking, his hands tucked into his pockets as he passed familiar landmarks. People walked past him, some recognizing him but choosing not to say anything. Others cast lingering glances, unsure if they should approach. He had gotten used to it by now, the unspoken curiosity, the assumptions, the weight of being associated with a name that carried so much history. Barron wasn't one for public spectacle. He had spent most of his life avoiding unnecessary attention, staying out of the political fray that often consumed his family. But moments like these reminded him that, whether he wanted it or not, people saw him as something more than just another young man walking through the city. Further down the block, a newsstand had a tabloid on display with a headline speculating about his future. Barron Trump, will he follow in his father's footsteps? He smirked slightly and kept walking. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about where he was headed, but very few ever asked him directly. The man in the cafe had, though in a confrontational way, but at least it was honest. A sudden gust of wind blew through the street, and Barron pulled his jacket tighter around himself. He reached a quiet park, taking a seat on a bench under a tree. The city's chaos was still present, but here, it felt slightly muted. As he sat there, he noticed a father and son playing catch a few yards away. The boy, no older than 6 or 7, threw the ball with all his might, only for it to land a few feet short. His father laughed, encouraging him to try again. Barron watched them for a moment, a rare expression of nostalgia flickering across his face. For all the assumptions people made about him, very few understood the complexities of growing up under a microscope. He hadn't had the luxury of simple childhood moments like this, running around in a park without cameras hiding in the distance, without people dissecting every gesture. His life had been different, shaped by forces outside his control, and yet, despite it all, he didn't feel trapped. He thought back to what he had said in the cafe. Choice isn't always about where you start. It's about what you do with what you have. He believed that. He had to. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from his mother, checking in on him. He smiled slightly, typing a quick response before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He stood up, taking one last look at the father and son before heading back toward the street. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt the weight of the encounter from the cafe begin to fade. He didn't know what that man had expected from him. Anger, defensiveness, maybe even arrogance, but he had given him none of that. Because Barron knew something most people didn't understand about him. He wasn't just his last name. He wasn't just the son of a former president. He was his own person. And no stranger in a cafe, no headline, no assumption was ever going to define that for him.